Hello, I am so delighted to be here. This is months in the making, and I feel like I know your family so well. And I just want to point out that this is actually a marriage record of Pierre Deary and Charlotte Bedard, and it gave me such joy to see the next generations doing shadow puppets over their marriage record from so many years ago. So starting out, so this is William, this is Finding Your Roots. This is kind of going to be our guideposts. Now, you see some names, you see some years with a dash, and the birth date, dash, and a death date. And one of my mentors told me, yes, genealogists love to collect names, they love to collect dates, but the thing we care most about is what happens in the dash. What happens in their lives? What can we learn about them? What can we pull out from the stories? Today you are with me, and I'm going to make you dive into some documents with me and find some really interesting things, because everybody's families are interesting, especially William's. So we're going to use his grandparents, each of the four, as guideposts to kind of walk through each family. So this is kind of a representation of where the immigrant ancestors lived and where they came from. And it's a really cool illustration because you can see, his grandparents were born in the United States, but then going back a generation on the Deary side, they lived in Quebec City. And then the next side, there was actually some German, and I put the flag of France, but she was actually from Alsace-Lorraine. And then going back to this side, so this is your Jewish ancestry. So they immigrated from what is now known as Poland. Starting off, we're going to work on the Deary family first, and this is just kind of some of the ancestors we're going to talk briefly about. And William, you are William Deary III, correct? Well, turns out your grandfather's birth certificate actually had his name as Edmund when it was first registered, which is so interesting to me. Now let's kind of get into this birth certificate and see what we can dig out. So it does have his parents. William Deary I was the son of George Deary and Rose Cloutier, which Larry had told me is the proper French pronunciation. They lived at 588 Laurel Avenue. He was the second born and the second living child at the time. And then you see that crossed out, and Edmund is gone and William is up on top. And that change was made May 9th, 1941. So what was happening in 1941 where people wanted to make sure their names and dates were correct? He wanted to get Social Security. So you have to get a new, prove your parents and your birth records when you apply for Social Security. So here we see this was pasted after the amended and corrected birth record. So this is the church where William Deary and Margaret Nair were married, and they married on August 7th, 1929 in Detroit. And this is a copy of their original marriage license. And it was a little tricky to read, but I got a lot of great information out of it. And one of the really cool things is that his wife, Margaret Nair, she worked as a nurse. And you think in 1929, there weren't as many women. Yeah, I thought that was so cool. Then, so William, he worked as a machinist, and then it specified he was an electrician, and he worked as an electrician for quite a while. So this is William Lawrence Deary's World War II draft registration card, and you can see the home at 2580 Hurlbut Avenue in Detroit. And that's a very important home. A lot of your ancestors live there. And it has his wife, Margaret Mary Deary, and their address. And he worked at the Zaka Coffee Company. And this photo is taken, the date of it, it's really close to when he worked there. So that's what the place he worked at would have looked like at the time. And he probably still worked as a machinist working on some of the coffee roasting stuff there. So now we're going to jump back to William's parents, George Deary and Rose Cloutier, and they were married on September 5th, 1905 in Detroit. And they're both 23 years old. George Joseph Deary registered for the World War I draft, and it's really great because we get his exact birth date, and we learn that he's a superintendent at the American Caulking Company. So let's look at Rose's birth record, Rose Cloutier, or Cloutier. So hers, as you can tell, this is getting a little bit bare bones. And she was the daughter of Frank Cloutier, and it also has Alvine Cloutier. And we also learned that Frank worked as a blacksmith. So She was likely the first of this family to be born in the United States because her older sister, who was 2 years older, was born in the St. Roch Parish in what is now Quebec City. We learned she was baptized on the 27th of June in 1880, and she was a legitimate marriage of Francois Xavier Cloutier. And so Francois and Frank are the same person. The American version of his name would be Frank. And he was a cordwainer, which is a shoemaker. And the mother was Marie Alvine Bisson of the parish. I was able to map some of the places because I was just really curious. Well, where did they live in Detroit? So you can see the earlier records that I find, they're a lot closer to city center. So Richard and Euphemia lived by George and Rose. And then George and Rose lived here briefly, and then as they got older, they moved out here, and William and Margaret, they essentially lived on the same, right around the corner from one another. This is how many generations the family was in Quebec before. So, he's the immigrant ancestor, and then it goes back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 generations, 7 generations to the immigrant ancestor. And the first record we have of him of Quebec is his marriage record. His name is Maurice, and he used the spelling D''Hery. And these all essentially are pronounced the same way, but we do see a lot of flip-flopping and just really strange spellings. Like sometimes it was just spelled D-E-R-I. Again, because back then people didn't really sweat the details when it came with how they spelled their names. I'm going to walk you through a couple of maps because the Deary family had such a deep history in Quebec City, and they lived mostly in the St. Roch ward, which is all the way up here. And I did find some of their addresses, and they were kind of in this neighborhood is where they lived. So this is a little bit more modern of a map. And you can see it's like at the confluence of the Charles and the Lawrence rivers. But like I said, they were there for so long. So this is an older map of 1771 outside of the city in St. Roch, or Charlesbourg is the other place where they lived. What was interesting because it was outside the city walls back then, but eventually the city grew enough and it all became one. This is the oldest record that I could find for your family, and it's, I think, 346 years ago that this happened, which is mind-blowing to think about. So this is the marriage of Maurice, and you can see clear as day the D''Hery to Madeleine Philippot. Again, for a record made in 1679, to have that level of detail is mind-blowing. We're going to hop over to the Nair side of the family. So this church is where John Nair was baptized on July 6, 1873, in St. Mark's Roman Catholic Church, Prescott, Ontario. And here are some of the ancestors we're going to talk about, and kind of William's grandmother, and then going back a few generations. So this is John E. Nair and Nair, thank you. This is John E. Nair and Mary McNeil's marriage record. They were married April 15th in 1902, and it has his full name. So he was 30 years old. They both lived in Detroit, and he worked as a furrier, which is somebody in the fur industry, usually like manufacturer or trader, things like that. And the fur industry was really important in this region because a lot of, like, dating back hundreds of years ago, they would come in from Quebec, and like the fur traders, before the Revolutionary War, would work in this area. So that's kind of like a really important historic occupation. Okay, let's learn about his wife. Her name was written as Mammy McNeil. She was 28. She lived in Detroit. She was born in New York. Nothing, unknown. We don't know who her mom is. We don't know who her dad is. So that's definitely a bit of a mystery. So after their marriage, again, they lived at the same address, the 2580 Herbal Avenue in Detroit. And this is the family in 1930. And what was so interesting to me is he's working as a furrier here, working in the fur industry. But by 1930, you can see that John, his occupation is up here. He was a stage employee at a local theater. So he worked at the theater, which was so interesting to me. And then, so a lot of their children were older and grown, and they were all working. So one of his sons also worked at the theater. And then there was a bookkeeper, there was a teacher. They were all kind of there living and working together. And again, finding historic photographs is difficult, but we have this really fantastic resource called the Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps, and it leaves this really fantastic record. So we can see it was a 2-story home, it had a porch, it had like a little back house. So John lived a very long life, and thankfully for me, he had his death record was really detailed and gave a lot of rich information about his family. His parents, Anthony Neyer, who was born in Austria, and then his mom, Eliza Amon, who was born in Alsace-Lorraine. His wife lived quite a bit longer. Now, this is taking you into the weeds with me. Do you see how difficult this record is to read? Yeah, like it is tough. So this is actually in a deed to the property that's available online. I found her death record. But remember, her marriage record didn't name her parents, so I know nothing. So, I get my kind of magnifying glass on, I squint a lot. I'm a professional squinter, so I'm gonna blow it up for you so you don't have to squint. Her birthplace is Brooklyn, New York. Okay, before it said New York, so having Brooklyn is pretty important to me. And then we get parents on her death record. She's the daughter of George McNeil and Anna Cuddy. So what I do when I get stumped with this, before I was talking about the importance of Social Security, I order their original application for Social Security. And then in this record, there was another surprise. Her father's George McNeil, her mother's Annie Houlihan, which is different than Cuddy. I'm like, okay. But then what's really interesting, it has an exact birth date, but she was living in Alameda, California. So I take all that information and I find her in Detroit before her marriage. This is in 1900, and she's living in the household of James Cuddy and Anna Cuddy, but her last name is written as McNeil, so it's Mamie McNeil, and it's exact match to her marriage record 2 years later. So as it turns out, she was James Cuddy's stepdaughter. Her mother had remarried, and I traced the family back to Brooklyn, which is really exciting. So they're living in Brooklyn, New York. This is the New York State Census, was taken in June of 1875. So there's her dad, George. He's 29 years old, reportedly 29 years old, and he's working as a grocer. So he had a grocery store in Brooklyn. And then his wife, Annie, and their young daughter, Mary. And the reason I couldn't find much about him is he died like 2 months later. So the census was taken in June and he died in August. His headstone had him a little bit younger. He was only 28 years old. And he was buried in the Columbia County Cemetery with his family. So essentially his wife, she worked as a seamstress in Brooklyn and supported herself and her young daughter in the 1870s by herself for a few years, and then they made their way to Detroit. So they came to Detroit before she remarried. And then she married her second husband, James Cuddy, and she lived with James for the rest of her life. But right now I'm going to talk mostly about the Reuben family, the 3 generations of Max, Charles, and Jacob. So this is Max Reuben's marriage record to Justine Jessie Makowski. Max lived on Riverside Drive in New York City, and then she lived on 161st Street in New York City. Max, he worked as a butcher. His father was Charles Reuben. His mother is Becky Levinsky. And Justine's father was Max, and her mother was Mary Resnick. So I'm like, what else can we know about Max? I have his parents' names from his marriage record. So this is a petition for naturalization, and there was a 2-step process where you declare your intention to become a citizen. You had requirements, you had to live here for so long, and then the second step is to file this petition. And during this period, this is a gold mine for me. I get very excited because it has specifically where his father Charles was born, in this place called Białystok in Poland, which was then called Poland. And it has his occupation, so he worked as a chauffeur or a driver. He's Hebrew, and it lists all of his children. So he has son Max, he has a daughter Frances, he has a son Nathan, and it tells me where all his children live, and it tells me the ship that he came on and the date that he came here. So I'm like, okay, great, let's go. Let's see what else we can find. So then with the information about his sons Max and Nathan, I was like, well, where are they? Why can't I find them in 1920 census? Max and Nathan were in the Brooklyn Hebrews Orphan Asylum. So they were orphans. But, so this is the headings, and I know it's tricky to read, but it says in this column, let's see, oh, here it is. Orphan, half orphan, both living parents. both living. So they weren't actually orphans, they were just living in an orphanage. And that was very common for Brooklyn during this period because life was rough. You're working hard for a wage, and basically they just couldn't afford to raise their children. So they would go spend time in an orphanage. And this is a historic photo, but I imagine it largely looked the same when they were there. So this is the Hebrew Orphan Asylum. But after they get out of the orphanage, he's living with his dad again, Charles. So there's the dad, Charles, the oldest daughter, Frances. There's Max, he's the oldest son, and then Nathan. And then there's this Albert. And I was like, what is Albert? So look, his older kids, 21, 18 years old, 16 years old. Albert is 7. What? Albert was born in Pennsylvania? What is going on here? There's something else going on. And the family, they all worked. Charles continued to work as a driver or a chauffeur. Frances was a sales lady. Max worked as an assistant in a laundry. And Nathan worked at the Postal Service. He was a postal clerk. So, they're all living together. Well, it turns out during that period around when Albert was born, they were in Pennsylvania. And so it says here that Charles W. Ettinger had a business partner, Charles Rubin. He was one of the new proprietors of this one-time famous Lehigh County hostelry. But in November of 1923, they went in together and they bought a hotel in Snyderville, Pennsylvania. So this is where they lived in New York City. And then this is Snydersville. And I did the Google Maps during rush hour, so it might take a little less than 2 hours to get there. But I was like, what are they doing out there? Turns out he had married again to another woman, and that's when the son Albert was born. They got into a little bit of trouble just a few months after they bought the hotel. Okay, 1924. Any history buffs know what was going on in the United States? Prohibition. So they got in trouble for selling liquor and running a bawdy house. Now, I will say, newspapers of this era love to be sensational. They kind of like to be dramatic. So if you're reading these, take it with a grain of salt. It seems like, oh, those are pretty serious charges. They never did any jail time as far as I can tell. They just had to pay some fines, and their property was obviously seized. I think in here it talks about how Charles wasn't there at the time because he was driving back to New York to get more liquor. So he actually didn't get arrested with a group of them. Yeah, so afterwards, he moved to New Jersey, believe it or not, and he had another restaurant after Prohibition. He ran a bar and grill, and he died in New Jersey in November 1942. So going back again to that immigrant ancestor, so Charles's father, Jacob, he came in Ellis Island, New York City, on August 23rd, 1901. His name wasn't Jacob, it was Jossel, which is likely the Hebrew variant of Jacob. Reuben, he was 37, and he worked as a weaver, which was interesting to me because when he came here, he didn't work in that industry at all. And then his son Charles, who was one of the older children, he came a couple years later in 1903. And again, his name was written as Chaskell Reuben. He was 17 years old at the time, or reportedly 17. And he's a fur maker. So these lines are so different, the Nair and the Reuben family, but you have another fur maker in your ancestry. Jacob Reuben had a wife, Esther, and they had a lot more kids. So she was the last to come. She didn't come until 1908. But here, this poor woman traveling on a boat all those weeks with kids 14 down to 3, like you can imagine, how difficult that might have been. I wanted to show you what's really interesting here is that, so they were using kind of the Hebrew variants of their first names, like Nissen became Nathan, and Meyer with a different spelling became Meyer. And so they all, after they had immigrated, had started to use these versions of their name. And so they all lived together in New York City, and Jacob actually lived a pretty calm life. So this is a newspaper article. Jacob was actually the one held up. It was hilarious. It was a young couple, and the woman had done the stick up, and she was known as the bobbed hair bandit. So he was working as a chauffeur, and they had held him up near his house. He lived until 1931, and he died of a stroke, cerebral hemorrhage, at the age of 64. So he and his wife are buried in the Mount Zion Cemetery in Queens. What's really fantastic here is that we can kind of calculate his birth year. It doesn't have an exact birth date, but it has the names of his parents, which are so important for continuing that research. And I had one of our Eastern European researchers kind of try and dig for records, and she didn't yet find it. But that's not to say that they're not out there somewhere. Okay, so last family, thank you so much for hanging in with me, is the Bukowski family. And this, what's that? Machioski? Thank you. Thank you so much. So this is a Machioski family, and it's really wonderful to find this newspaper. So this is, that's Jessie right here. That's her mother. These are her sisters. That's her stepfather. And then these are her niece and nephew. And so here they are in the 1905 New Jersey census. And we can tell that Max, he came in like 1889, he immigrated. And then his wife, Mary, came a little bit later. He worked as a laborer in the oil works. This is in Bayonne, New Jersey. And at that time in Bayonne, there was a huge Standard oil field, and everyone from that community worked in the oil fields. They had 5 children, but this census records tells me that only 3 were living, so 2 children had died young. So this is a timeline. So this is really only 5 years in the life of this family, and these are the things that happened. So first, Max and Mary's 16-year-old daughter, Julia, died from pneumonia. And then later that year, in November, they lost a 2-year-old as well. She had scarlet fever. So obviously it was a really tough time for the family. And then Justina was born. So they did have a new baby. So she was born March 10th, 1912. Her father died the next month on April 12th, 1912. Now imagine being Mary, you have a newborn, you have an infant, and all these other young children to look at. It must have been really difficult for her. And she did end up remarrying that same year in September, likely for support, because it was really difficult. There's a really interesting story with this family. So Mary Wen is the daughter, the oldest daughter, Mary. And what happened was her sister gave this testimony in her naturalization records. And it says, "I am her sister. I have known her since my birth. In 1913, I went to Poland together with Mary Wen to our grandparents." So they shipped 2 of the girls back to Poland. And Helen came back, but Mary stayed in Poland. She stayed there as a result, because of citizenship laws at the time. She ended up marrying someone over there, Stefan Wynn, and she lost her United States citizenship because she married somebody from Poland. She has a really large immigration file that we have a copy of if you're interested in, and it documents all the places they lived. And I get really excited because the first place she went is this Isby, and that Isby is going to be really key because that's where Max was born. So having that place was really key, because then I remember Max, who died young with leaving his wife and young children. I found his baptismal record, and man, these Catholic records are detailed, and I was so excited because I can read Latin. So the one really cool thing that I loved finding this record, knowing I had the right one, is there's this later note, and it has a plus, and it has A-M-E-R, which means he went to America. So that was the notation. So if he married in the church, they would have written his marriage and death date there. But that's how I knew that he immigrated to America. And then I also found his wife's baptismal record, and it's equally detailed. She was born the 17th of May, 1879, baptized 3 days later, and it has her family. And what's nice is her father was Daniel Resnick, essentially is what they spelled it in English, and her mother Pelagi, and it matched exactly to her second marriage record. So I knew I had the right person. And so, she had a lot of tragedy earlier in life, but her and her husband, Nick, were married for over 50 years, and they had a big party, and there was a newspaper. I thought they were just the cutest couple in that photo. And what I really liked is her obituary kind of honors her first husband. So it has her married last name of Wenko, and it has her 2 names in her obituary, and it has the details of her life. So that is, again, we're just scratching the surface, but it was really a delight to walk you through and trace your roots. Anyone have any? Oh, I also included this map showing all the different places where they came, and it's color coordinated with their dots on the tree to show kind of where they came, where they landed, and where they went. So it's really cool to see at a high level.